If we inspect an octahedron composed of 8 sides of triangles, and we make believe that each triangular face is not triangular in shape, but instead is a round disc with teeth on it, such as the gears of a disc, and that it's meshing with adjacent faces, this creates 4 axes of rotation, unlike the 3 axes of rotation of the Cartesian coordinate system, in which each of the 3 axes do not overlap. In this 4 axes of rotation, or 4 dimensions, they do overlap. Now, I got this idea going back to Buckminster Fuller's book called Synergy, in which he described this geometric form and this polyhedron. And then I realized that if you wanted to create an inductive furnace to transmute a material substance such as shale, if you're dredging the bay of a harbor and you want to, the mud keeps coming in from the river, feeding the opening of the river that enters the ocean at that harbor point. You don't want the ships to not be able to use the port, so you're constantly dredging the mud from the bottom of the harbor. What do you do with it? Where do you put it? Or if you have toxic waste in garbage that's even non-toxic, just plain garbage, in our modern day commercial-based world, what do you do with all that garbage? How do you get rid of it? So instead of burying it or burning it, or and if it's toxic, instead of worrying about it leaking, you turn it into something else. And the technique involves, I got this, I learned this from the Lemurian Fellowship Foundation. It's basically a timeless technique that exists in nature, and people just discover it, rediscover it. They lose it and rediscover it. So, over eons of time. And I got this idea in my head that how would you construct such a furnace? Well, it's inductive in nature. In other words, it induces a series of processes. And the first step is to convert that material substance into light, and then by raising its frequency, and then dropping its frequency down to a specific frequency that is associated with a specific isotope of a specific chemical element that we know of on the periodic chart of the elements. Now, the original material that you start with has a mixture of frequencies represented by the various neutron counts of the various atoms in that substance. So the neutron count of an atomic element is its frequency, and it varies based on the isotope of that element. Meanwhile, so it's the frequency. The frequency is the frequency component or variable of the 2 electrical reactant formulas, namely capacitive reactance and inductive reactance. Meanwhile, the electron is represented by inductance for the formula of inductive reactance, and the proton in the atom, in our physics model of the atom, is represented by capacitance within the formula for capacitive reactance. Now, these 2 forces, known as capacitive reactance and inductive reactance, are the 2 forces that make up the electrodynamic definition of the atom of physics within a context of time. That's where frequency comes into the picture. And it's the frequency of oscillations. Anyway, so these 2 forces, when they're combined, these 2 forces, when they're combined, create the atom. The two material sub-forces, because they're subatomic, the 2 electrodynamic forces of electrical reactance within a context of time, which is the 3rd ingredient of electricity, and it's the 3rd ingredient of the atom, is time. So how would you construct such a furnace to do the job, to turn a material substance into light, which basically means you're disassociating the material substance, because light cannot travel through empty space. There's no such thing as photons, massless photons. And we know this is true because when the transatlantic telegraph cable of the 1800s was being laid across the Atlantic Ocean, they had a problem with the magnetic field. Could not traverse the oceanic distance of that transmission cable without dissipating quite rapidly, causing, well, at first there was a phase shift, and then because the magnetic field couldn't keep up with the electric field, also known as the dielectric field, also known as the electrostatic field. So the voltage got across the ocean very nicely, but the magnetism couldn't keep up. And this one fact alone supports the idea that's a little renegade, a little outside the box of modern-day physics, but it supports the idea that light cannot travel through empty space because the magnetic component of power, electrical power, that, defined by Ohm's law, cannot make it. It just can't handle the hazard of going across empty space. So it quickly retards. This is the magnetism is an expression of inductive reactance, which is basically a lagging current. And boy, does it lag. And it keeps lagging, and the lagging builds up. And so consequently, you might end up with no magnetic field coming across a long transmission line at all. Copper cable transmission line, just the electrostatic component of the transmission of electric power. And that's capacitive reactance. It has no problem going across a copper line, but the magnetic component does have a problem. Well, this is why we raise the material substance to the frequency of light, because light is the disassociative frequency for matter, for material substance. If we want to disassociate physical matter, we convert it into light. But we still possess its electrostatic feature, and it is virtual because it's no longer material. It's immaterial. It's a virtual state because it's only one force of nature, the electromagnetic force. No, excuse me. Yes, the EMF the electromagnetic force, minus the magnetomotive force that we measure as current or magnetism. And then we drop that frequency down to a specific frequency associated with a specific isotope of a chemical element from the periodic chart of the elements, and we get a pure substance, 100% pure, no impurity whatsoever. It could be aluminum, could be carbon-12 or some other isotope of carbon, whatever we want it to be. That's what it'll be. And it'll be similar in cost to the cost of smelting copper ore from, taking the raw copper ore out of the earth and turning it into pure copper metal. It'll cost the same as that. So for that type of price, for smelting copper ore into copper metal, we can literally create gold, aluminum, uranium, anything we like. But what is the geometry of the inductive forces that are required to make this happen? So we have the theoretical knowledge, but we need the geometry to make it happen. And I believe the octahedron is the key, because we have four axes of rotation, and if we look at adjacent faces, any four, so we have one face and we have three adjacent faces, because each face is triangular in its maximum scope, if we disconsider the rotation aspect of this thing. And so look at that. It's two rotating planes that are rotating in opposite directions. That means they're not going to grind or thrash the teeth of those two adjoining gears. And now if we look at this one, it's going in opposite directions. And if we look at this one, they're going in opposite directions. So, despite the fact that at the center you're going to have grinding of, how do you obviously you don't have four, you're not going to, it's not going to permit the material, if you had a material axle going through each opposing face. See, this one is going that way, but its opposing face is going in the same direction but looking from the opposite direction, so it looks like it's flipped, but that's really a matter of perspective. So it is describing, You know, just like you have a wheel axle on either the front or back end of a car, and you've got two wheels on either end of that axle. Likewise, if we had four imaginary axles with two gear wheels on the two ends of each of the four axles, at the center, they'd be grinding. It's only at the eight faces that they do not. And so if the material substance is held, somehow magnetically held at the center of this inductive furnace, it'll grind it like hell. And at the same time, we want to raise its vibration to the vibration of visible light. So it kind of begs or suggests that those two actions are going to be complementary, namely the grinding at the center of this thing and changing the frequency of that magnetic induction to the frequency of visible light, some band or another. You know, I don't know. I think it's white. It's supposed to be white light, but what's white light? That would be a mixture of frequencies of the rainbow. So it's actually, you're going to be using a complex of frequencies, not a single frequency, to turn that material substance firstly into light. But then you would use a single frequency, drop down from the complex frequencies of light that is associated with the frequency for that isotope of that atomic element. So it's a two-step process. Anywho, what would be the waveform of those complex of frequencies of light? I don't know. Are they sine waves? Are they triangular waves? Are they waves in which the voltage and the amperage are 180 degrees out of phase with each other to create the maximum dissociation of the material substance into light, as you're at the same time that you're increasing the frequency and you're bombarding it with four axes of rotation? Yeah, I think it would be a complex of factors to be able to make the thing work. But that's what I've been gelling, slowly growing in my mind over many years. Slightly more than a decade when I first constructed this over 10 years ago. No, it was exactly 10 years ago in 2012. That I constructed this model to help me visualize what was happening and confirm that each face is rotating in a counter direction, so that it's on the face, on the eight faces, it works out. It's only at the center that it's grinding like hell. But that's okay. So all your substance will be falling into the center. Now, I don't know how you magnetically induce the material substance to stay in the center. I suppose it would be not a magnetic induction. It would be actually an electrostatic induction, now that I think of it. Yeah, I think this thing operates by capacitive forces alone. In other words, electrostatic forces alone. That means, what does that mean? That means, well, let's see, if opposing faces were opposite polarity, like one was positive and this one was negative, then you'd have eight polarizations in opposing pairs of polarity on opposite faces here. That would create a vortex of attraction, so that if you had a high enough charge of voltage, it would cause the particles to come together. So I guess a preparatory state before putting the substance inside this furnace would be to grind it into a fine powder, whatever it might happen to be. And since silt dredged up from the bottom of a estuary, the mouth of a river in a harbor, is already kind of sandy or even finely ground as clay, fine particle size, you've already got a lot of your work cut out for you. Maybe all you have to do is filter it to keep the grain size down to a certain minimum size. But regardless of how you do it, it sounds like the preparatory material would have to be a fine powder in order for this to work, because you want to be able to charge it with a mere electrostatic force to cause it to, all the particles to attract and clump into a solid clump at the center of this furnace. So it's similar to an inductive furnace, but it's not induction. It's not inductance which runs this furnace, it's capacitance. Aha! So it's good I made this video, because now I can see what kind of furnace it is. when I read about this story, um, it said it was similar to an inductive furnace, which was popular in the 1800s when this story was relayed, or slightly after the 1800s, around the turn of the century. So we were familiar with inductive furnaces at that time, having operated them for, I don't know, half a century or thereabouts, up to that point in our history of technical engineering and know-how. But it's merely said it's like it. It didn't say that it was it. And so I couldn't imagine how it would be different, but now I can see why, or how, or what. It's probably capacitance, a capacitant furnace, not a furnace of capacitance rather than a furnace of inductance. There you go.